Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. We have a very, very special speaker today, Professor Elfatih Eltahir at MIT, the former president of ASAPA. Professor Elfatih has a lot of work and has a very long accomplishment and CV, but I just want to mention maybe one of the greatest honors that someone could achieve in the field of engineering, that he has been inducted into the National Academy of Engineering as of last week. This is such a great honor. I would like to say, though, that it's an honor to the National Academy of Engineering to have you, Elfatih. And you really make us proud, and we are so happy for this. So thank you again. Yeah. And thank you for being here with us and giving us your time and sharing your knowledge with everyone in ASAPA and beyond. I would like to give you the floor and we'll be enjoying your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Muntasir. And thank you everyone for coming. I'm very glad to participate in this event for ASAPA. It's one of the activities that I was really very proud to start with a group of you. And I wish ASAPA all the success, and I'm happy to be part of this webinar series. I would like to talk to you today about the hydrology and climate of the Nile. This is my area of specialization is hydrology and climate, and I would like to talk about the hydrology and climate of the Nile Basin, but more presented with the perspective of how we could establish a scientific basis for water development projects in Sudan. And so with that, if we think of, let me see here, this is, let's do something up here. So if we look at the last 10,000 years and we look at the Nile Basin, there is paleoclimatic records, paleoclimatic evidence that about maybe 10,000 years ago, the population of the Nile was concentrated on the Nile Valley. And you see here actually concentrated in the Nile Valley. A lot of it is in southern Egypt and northern Sudan. I mean, 10,000 years ago there was no political border, so it was just one national unit. And you see the evidence, the scientific evidence from paleoclimatic records shows that most of those people were right at the border. And so when people talk about this pharaonic civilization, Northern Sudan had a lot to do with it. And then if you progress in time, like, in the next 2,000 years or so, there is evidence that the area was very green, relatively very green compared to 10,000 years ago. And so, and associated with that is evidence that human settlements, which are shown here in red, human settlements basically spread all over the desert. And then that started changing again towards the drying that it started like maybe 9,000 years ago, leading to complete drying of the desert that's around 7,000 years ago or so. And with that, you see movement of human settlements back again to the Nile Basin. And so I show these pictures to indicate that the status of the climate and the status of water throughout the history, thousands of years time scale, have been a significant determinant of people life, people culture, where do they settle, and they do tend to migrate in response to this natural phenomena. The emergence, actually, what happened here, the latest drying, that's 5,300 to 3,500 BCE, that drying coincided with the emergence of the pharaonic civilization. This is the famous Akhenaton Nefertiti picture. Akhenaten is one of my, well, actually, he's my favorite pharaoh. And for reasons I'm going to share with you. Here, this is a picture for him sitting with his wife, Nefertiti, and their 3 daughters, and his god Aton, which is the god of the sun. And this is a picture actually from the Museum of Berlin. Akhenaten is a very significant character in the history of that part of the world. He was a revolutionary. He is the first person to introduce monotheism. He brought this god Aten, the monotheism, the first time. He basically advocated the worship of one god instead of many of them, and so on. And he also moved his capital. And if that sounds familiar, then that's a very old tradition in that part of the world. One thing that connects Akhenaten to Sudan is that his mother actually is the indication is that she is Nubian, of Nubian origin, and she was very influential and she had played a significant role in the history. So that's a little bit of diversion from the topic. That's about the pharaohs and their civilization, but that's very much was the start of that was all related to an event in which the climate changed, the water conditions changed. If we move in time fast and we look at recent history, there is a lot going on about water and water in the Nile and the politics of Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. It's even they have been meetings in the White House, discussions about the GERD and the dam being built in Ethiopia and all of that. It's a topic that is still, the Nile and its water plays a significant role in the life of people from the times of Akhenaten to the times of Trump. However, I would like to take a step backward and share with you a story that was shared with the MIT graduating class like about maybe 10 years ago by Chuck Vest. Chuck Vest used to be the president of MIT, and he was quite a visionary leader of the institute. And he told a story about, I call it here, knowing where to mark the chalk X. He told the story about something that happened in GE, like in the turn of the 20th century. And GE faced a problem with one of their generators. And this is like, in our time, this is like saying Microsoft, faced a problem with its operating system. It's like a big deal. So they looked around and they brought this consultant, this guy here. His name is Steinmetz, the guy with the dress here in suit and so on. Steinmetz was a genius. They brought him to help GE solve a problem with their generator. And so early models of generators. And so what he did is he basically spent time, found the problem difficult, closeted himself in a room with the generator, drawings and paper and pencils, as it is picture shown here. And then at the end, he told them, okay, I figured it out. I knew how to correct the problem. So after he left, the GE engineers found that he had a large X drawn with a chalk on the side of the generator casing. And there was a note saying, if you just cut the casing in this area, open that location, remove so many turns of wire from the starter, then everything will work properly. And they did his prescription and everything did work properly. So when they asked him, however, how much he's going to, be paid for it, he replied his answer was really shocking. He asked for $1,000, and that's, you could think about it, it's like someone doing consulting work nowadays, and when you ask for how much, they say $1 million or something. So it's a big sum of money for the early 20th century. So GE was stunned, the bureaucracy were stunned. So they asked him for an invoice. Tell us, how do you basically justify that? So he basically told them, marking the chalk X on the side of the generator is $1. Knowing where to mark the chalk X is $999. And so the idea is when you are faced with a problem, you know, the role of science, the role of knowledge, the role of scientific facts and scientific analysis and so on, it is very valuable compared to you know, anything else. And so when we are faced with the problem of the Nile, I wondered for some time, you know, do we know where to mark the X for the Nile problem? And that's actually the metaphor that you could take in many of the problems that are facing society and maybe society in Sudan. Is like when people go about developing solutions for them, do they really know where to mark the X on the side of that problem? And so I add that for the case of the Nile. And so I diagnose some of the problems we're having there is that there is too much focus on short-term issues without addressing the long-term security concerns of Egypt and the legitimate development aspirations of Ethiopia and Sudan. That's the diagnosis of where the problems are. So it is, you focus on a dam that's going to be built, but you don't focus on, like, you know, bigger problems that are facing the region. And so that created a mistrust between Ethiopia and Egypt. And even if an agreement is reached about this dam, and the dam is being built anyway, it's still important long-term trends will need to be addressed. And so addressing these important long-term trends is what should define the solution and what should define the path forward. And a few years ago, I published this book. I call it A Path Forward for Sharing the Nile Water. I published it with a group of my students and research group members. This is a picture, actually, it's one of my favorite pictures about the Nile. This is a picture of a nilometer. A nilometer is a device that you use to measure the flow in the Nile. And it's from the 19th century. This explorer was traveling in Egypt, and he found this in a place called Rauda in Cairo. And so these gentlemen, they go down the stairs, they look at this column, and the column is graded so that you could see what the level of water. And so because of that, we have very long records of the Nile water. And a long time ago, I did go in an MIT trip. We visit many of the archaeological sites in Egypt. And it was very striking that most of the significant archaeological sites along the Nile, you will find a nilometer next to the site. So the Egyptians were very much interested in monitoring the Nile River. So let me share with you some background information, especially for those of you who are not experts on this area. Where does the water of the Nile come from? If you think, when we think of water in systems like the Nile, we think the unit of calculation becomes a cubic kilometer. So think of a cubic kilometer. It's 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer in area and 1 kilometer in the vertical. It's a huge amount of water. So if you think of 7 units being the 84 cubic kilometers of the Nile. So if you think of 1 unit to be 12 cubic kilometers, the Nile annual flow at Aswan is about 84 cubic kilometers. So meaning that the Nile flow is about 7 units, each of the units is 12 cubic kilometers. So where does that water come from? 2 units originate from Uganda, from the Lake Victoria. They flow through South Sudan, and in South Sudan, one of those 2 units gets lost to evaporation from the swamps, okay? There is a river called Sobat that comes from Ethiopia, and it meets the White Nile next to Malakal, and that river brings 1 unit, one of those 12 cubic kilometer units. So that makes the flow in the White Nile about 2 cubic kilometers, and then the Blue Nile, which is the largest tributary of the Nile, brings 4 units. And so you get 2 units from the White Nile, 4 units from the Blue Nile, that makes it 6. And then the Atbara River brings 1 unit. So that gives the 7 units that go into Egypt. So in general, the hydrology of the Nile is such that 2 units emerge from Central Africa and 6 units emerge from, and one of those 2 units that emerge from Central Africa get lost in the swamps in the south. And then 6 units come from Ethiopia. So if you think about it, Ethiopia contributes 6 out of the 7 units. Okay, and if you see where that water is mostly consumed, maybe 6 out of the 7 units is consumed in Egypt. So think about it. Ethiopia produces 6 out of 7, and Egypt consumes 6 out of 7. And so when you think of the Nile and the Nile water, and they talk about this Nile Basin Initiative and all these countries like Tanzania and Uganda and Kenya and so on, I have been very skeptical of those processes because, you know, if you think about it, a country like Tanzania and Ethiopia, there is nothing that combines the two, nothing. There is no river that flows from one to the other. There is no, so bringing all these people, putting them in one room and starting talking about the Nile problems, I don't think it's productive. And the experience showed that it hadn't been productive. And it's important to, from a figure like this, is to have the understanding that, you know, most of the Nile water comes from Ethiopia, and currently most of the Nile water is consumed in Egypt. And so if there are conflicts, the main two parties in those conflicts are basically Egypt and Ethiopia, and Sudan is to a second degree is part of that situation. So this is that's why when I look at the Nile and study the Nile, I focus on really this corridor here of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. That's really most of the action is water coming from Ethiopia going through Sudan gets consumed in Egypt. To a first degree, that's what happened in that system, and people should have that clear, because if you don't have that clear, then you basically a lot of confusion gets generated, and that contributes to the lack of progress that have been experienced throughout the modern history of the region. Okay, so in this book that I shared with you, I developed something which I call the equation of Africa's future. It's very, you know, that's a half true, half joke, but it's an equation that I think is very important in basically telling us about what the future of this continent, including Sudan and including Egypt and Ethiopia and everyone. So the idea here is that if you think in general, that the main economic activity in Africa is agriculture, and the main thing that gets people produce are crops. In terms of production, of course, there are lots of people like sitting in Khartoum and elsewhere. They produce very little. They just consume. But really, real economy in Sudan is agriculture, and real economy is controlled by how much crops the country produces. And so that's actually proportional to how much water you use. This is very clear here. This is a recent paper from my group where we showed what does Egypt do with the water. So we figured out exactly how much they use for cotton, for rice, for basin, for wheat, and so on. So it's very interesting. This is a work of one of my students, Kasia Nickel, that did a PhD recently. And you see that Egypt consumes all that water. So water basically translates into production of these crops. There are other examples from elsewhere. However, it's not just water. It depends on how you use the water. So water meaning that, you know, you apply the water, but you have to use technologies. You use seeds, you use fertilizers, you use irrigation. So how much crop you produce is not just function of how much water, but function of what kind of technologies do you use. Do you use fertilizers or not? What kind of seeds do you use? What kind of irrigation do you use? And so on. And so if you then account, like in any system, you have to account, you know, per unit, per person. So that's the production is water multiplying the technology divided by the population until the population size is important. And then if you do simple math, you know, really simple math, is actually, I think is high school calculus. You could basically take the you know, the natural log of both sides, and you then take a derivative and of that, and that basically translates into this beautiful equation that I really like, and that's why I celebrate it, and I call it the equation of futures of Africa. And what it shows here, this is the relative change in crop production, which means economic growth, basically how the economy is moving, is function of how the relative change in water availability, and that's basically climate change, the relative change in technology adoption, so how technology, the rate by which we develop and use technologies, agricultural technologies in this case, and then here the population is showing And the nice thing that the population is the only variable that showed with a negative sign, which means population is negative. It's a negative process. Technology adoption is positive. Climate change could be positive or negative. And depending on how, so the story, the wisdom of this equation and the story of that book I showed is that the future of Africa will depend on how we manage these trends. So there is a trend in climate, there is a trend on how we adopt technology and how we become more technologically advanced, and then how we treat also the population. Depending on how these three trends are managed, that's, I think, is what's going to determine the future of the continent of Africa, which means, and the Nile Basin is just a microcosm of Africa. That's how we describe it. And Sudan is just at the heart of that Nile Basin. And so if you want to think of long term, not just like beyond our life scale, like the next 100, 200 years, how things are going to look in that part of the world, it depends on how society manages these important trends in climate, in population, but also in technology. And that's with technology goes education and all that stuff. So what do I mean by these things in more concrete terms? Technology adoption, things like, simple technologies. For example, this is how you could line canals to reduce losses of water. That's a technological water use efficiency measure that you could do. How you apply water, do you use drip irrigation or you just flood? Drip irrigation is smarter than flood irrigation. How much irrigation? Look at this. This is a picture that really tells a lot about Africa. Look at how this picture and how Europe and Asia, there is a lot of irrigated land in green and yellow and so on. And look at how Africa is really wide. The only spots in Africa where there is some levels of irrigation is like the delta of the Nile in Egypt, and then a Jazeera scheme showed up here. But look at this western part and Central Africa, very little irrigation is done. And that contributes to the low productivity of agriculture, and that contributes to the poverty that prevalent in our continent. So the irrigated area in Africa amounts to only about 30% of the potential area, while in Asia and Europe and everyone else is close to like 90% and 100% and so on. The largest irrigation areas are in the Delta and the Jazeera, and there is strong need for more efficient irrigation in the Nile. Another area where technology is important is in the use of fertilizers. This is one very important figure, I think. It was an eye-opener for me when I first seen it in a presentation by this person, Professor Tillman, and he shared with me his slide. So this shows how much fertilizer people use and how much is the cereal yield, how much you produce in terms of agriculture in tons per hectare. So this is important. It's not like how many hectares you have, but how much you produce from per unit area. And so the use of fertilizers correlates significantly with the productivity, with the yield and the productivity of agriculture. And you see here countries, developed countries, this is like Europe and North America and so on, they produce a lot. Developing, most of them in Asia, China, and India. And Professor Tillman told me that this least developed, this is basically Africa. And so this is African countries, they use very little fertilizers, they produce very little yield. And that's a big problem. That's the big problem for Africa. That's the big problem for Sudan, actually. And it's something that's got my attention, and we have a new project that basically tries to address some of that. So that's the technology adoption part. The second part I would like to look at is this population growth, which is a big problem. Population trends, the world now has about 8 billions. Out of those 8 billions, 1.25 billions are in Africa. It's projected to increase, by 2 billions in the future. One of those 2 billions, actually more than that, is now 1.2 billions, are going to be in the African continent. Africa, which has about 15% of the world population by 2050, and 2050 is not very far, maybe so the older among us may not be around, but but the younger may be around, and definitely children, our children are going to be there. So in that world, Africa, which has 15% of the population, is going to be responsible for 50% of the increase in population. So we are going to add double the population of Africa in the next 27 years or so. That's a big, big problem. I was reading an article in The Economist earlier today. It talked about Africa adding every 2 years the equivalent of the population of France. Think about it. France or Thailand, these are like medium-sized countries that have 50, 60 million people. So every 2 years, there is the size of France is added to the population of Africa. And we are going there. So in my view, this is the biggest challenge facing the African continent, is the biggest challenge facing the Nile Basin, is the biggest challenge facing Sudan. And so that's something I have been trying to talk about in my presentations and so on, because this is a problem that cannot be neglected. So this is on top of what already happened. If you look at, like, I was born somewhere here around 1961 or so, and you see since then the world population like 2.5 times increased by 2.5. But look at Africa more than quadrupled. So already we had a huge population growth, and as a result of it, the economies in Africa, the politics in Africa, a lot of these things are not in good shape. We're having big troubles in that continent. And ESE here, these are Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. We just followed what Africa did. And so on top of that, that's where another doubling is going to happen. And so this phenomenon is behind a lot of the problems that we are facing. And I could literally see it when I walk in the streets of Khartoum or when I look at anything. And if people don't notice that, this is some satellite pictures. For example, this is the Cairo in Egypt, and how Cairo in Egypt since 1984, how it evolved based on what the satellites. And so you could see how the extent of that and the urbanization and how the population basically increased, contributed all that. I'm going to repeat it here. And you see, new capital, but all these areas really grew significantly, and satellites are watching these changes. You could also see that's not actually only Egypt, that's Sudan too. You look at Khartoum, and you could see how the areas west of the Nile, east of the Nile, there's just tremendous growth in population, and a lot of it is people moving from the regions, different regions, moving to the capital, but it's also a lot of it is growth. Those people are moving because the problem of population increase had differentials, and some of these poorer regions of Sudan, they have larger increases in population, and there is no systems to sustain them, so they have to move to the capital. And so that creates a lot of that behind a lot of the tensions, a lot of the problems that basically exist in the country. And including what happened in this revolution when people went out to the streets. I mean, suddenly everyone in Khartoum discovered that we have so many young people. All those young people who went and demonstrated, they are basically assigned for the shape of the population pyramid that we have in Sudan. It's a population pyramid that basically reflective of this population growth issue. So that's the issue of population, and one of the things that's going to happen is like, if you think of the most populous countries in the world. So if you take the top 10 populous countries in the world, this is a very exclusive club where it used to be China, India, and Bangladesh, and so on. Slowly, African countries are creeping in. So by 2015, Nigeria became a member of that club. And by 2050, the forecast is that 3 other countries, Congo, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Nigeria, also 4 countries from Africa will join that club. And what concerns us here is that Ethiopia and Egypt are going to be members of that. There's going to be centers for large population. And so I'm a hydrologist and I study climate. Why am I spending all this time talking about population? is because there is direct relationship between demand on water and the size of the population. And that you see here, with the increase in population that's projected in Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, this is how much water would be available per person. So if these trends that are projected now to happen, and to a large degree, these trends are going to be, large part of it is going to be happen because large part of it is already built into the system through a concept called population momentum. The poverty, the water poverty, water per capita will go down below the absolute water scarcity, even for Ethiopia, which is supposedly rich in terms of water resources. So these trends in population, if we let them go and continue this way, they're going to really dim the prospects of any bright future for Africa, for the Nile, or for Sudan. And the main way, the policy that's needed to address the population problem, people know it for some time, is education of women, but not education of women as like going to universities and becoming doctors and engineers and so on. Education of women to high school level, mainly targeting underprivileged populations, poor areas of the country. Where women don't have the opportunity to basically go to school and they basically get married early and have children. And so there is a significant correlation around the world with this total fertility rate and the percentage of girls that gets enrolled in secondary school. So I have been a strong advocate for expansion of secondary school education in Africa. And even if it's not for population, it's a good thing to do anyway. And so that's something that we should all support. So the last trend, so we talked about technology adoption, we talked about population growth. The last trend that I think is important is the trend on climate. And climate, while population growth, impact the demand on water, technology adoption is important because also if you use fertilizers and seeds and you are more productive, then you don't need to use more water. You use less water. If you could get more production by going horizontally and using more water, or by going vertically and having higher inputs in terms of technology, and that reduces the demand of water. Climate change, however, works on the supply side. And so if you think of time series, this is the data for the Atbara flow and for the upper Blue Nile. I had a student, Siam, a few years ago, published this paper in Nature, in which he analyzed this series to see how the average flow had been changing. So the mean of the flow in the Atbara River increased by about 17%. The mean of the Blue Nile had increased by 10%. But that increase was also associated by changes in the standard deviation. So you have now more water, but more water coming with more interannual variability. And that's something that had already been seen. And that's something that's also projected to be the case in the future. So this is looking at all the climate models that are projecting the future, and you see how the tendency will be for increases in the mean flow by maybe about 15% or so, but also increases in the variability. So what that means is you get more water, but you get years of above flooding area years and then drought years. So flood and droughts, which any engineer would tell you, if I have floods and droughts increase, then what I need to do is I need to build more dams, because that's how you smooth the variability from year to year. You store the water from the year of more flow and you use it during the years of drought. So here climate change is saying, is a mixed picture. So climate change is saying that the flow is going to increase. So instead of 82 cubic kilometers, we are going to have 90 cubic kilometers, but the standard deviation is going to increase too. And because of that, I need to build more dams so that I could capture the additional flow. So the good news is that there is more water. The bad news is that that water would require some investments in infrastructure in order to be able to utilize it fully. And so the picture that we get from it is that the good news, if we focus on that, the mean flow is likely to increase. And so in this book that I showed the picture for earlier, we proposed one way forward, a path forward for sharing the Nile water. And what I suggested is that Sudan and Egypt preserve their current shares according to the Nile water agreement of about 56 kilometers and about 18.5 cubic kilometers. And this additional water that climate change brought in, we allocate that to Ethiopia. Ethiopia's situation is different than Sudan and Egypt. It's a country that receives a lot of rainfall. So the needs for water there are not really that significant. So if you calculate how much Ethiopia would need for irrigation, it's only about 5 to 7 cubic kilometers. And so, because it receives a lot of rain. I mean, I wrote a paper recently in which I argued that the main function of the Nile in Ethiopia is to drain the land. Ethiopia is a very different environment than Egypt, for example. The main function of the Nile in Egypt is to irrigate the land because it's a desert. But Ethiopia is not a desert. It receives a lot of rainfall. And if the Nile does not carry that water out of Ethiopia, there would be water logging. You cannot have agriculture. Sometimes, when I took my first class in irrigation, the class is called irrigation and drainage, because sometimes in order to cultivate the land, you need to irrigate them. But many times you need to irrigate to cultivate the land, you need to drain the land. That's actually the situation, for example, in Ireland, where I did my early studies in hydrology. The Irish rivers, the main function of the Irish rivers is to drain the land, not to irrigate the land. Because if you don't drain the land, it becomes waterlogged, you cannot have agriculture. Ethiopia is more similar to that. And that's why, you don't think of allocating similar amount of water to like Ethiopia and Egypt because of the different natural conditions that exist in those countries. But you could ask the legitimate question, how much water would Ethiopia need in order to irrigate its crops? And without any constraints, you find that it's only about 5 to 7 cubic kilometers. The added water from climate change could address that issue. So what does this formula mean for these three countries? What it means is that, first, if we think of Egypt consumes too much water and increasingly so. And you could see that, how that increase is happening, how the delta of Egypt, how it has grown. Like this is a very, I could repeat this movie again, and you could see how, the delta is expanding. So, and that's all water being used. It's actually, if you focus even in Sina here, there is development. Sina did not have much agriculture early on, but with time, water had been transferred there and all that. So there is a lot of development in terms of use of water in Egypt. And that use of water in Egypt is again driven by this population. This is the population during the last 2,000 years. And you see here how actually 1,400 years, not 2,000, but you see the world population just exploded recently, and Egypt's population too has followed that. And so the Nile water, however, and we have long records of the Nile, like that Nilometer I shared with you earlier, the Nile water did not change much. So think about it. I mean, here you have demand increasing, supply is constant. So not only that, but also Egypt had been growing economically. And so what determines the demand of water is not only the population, but consumption of the population. And here, this is an interesting figure I would like to share with you. We were able in our research to document the patterns of consumption that associates with this economic development. So Egypt basically, with the development, the Egyptians are eating less full and tamia, beans and stuff like this. Pulses, they are eating less in blue, and they are eating more meat. Of course, that's, so you ask what's a hydrologist has to do with what people eat. It takes much more to produce meat than to produce food like beans. And so it takes actually maybe a factor of 10. So when people move in their consumption patterns from eating beans to eating meat, they demand more water, and that creates problems. And that's a real situation. This had been documented before in Japan, in Korea, and this is the first time I think it's been documented in Africa. And so the Egyptians, to their credit, they did everything they could to face this, demands on water. So they control the highest one dam instead of the Nile flow fluctuating. Now it's under control. They increase productivity of agriculture. Agriculture in Egypt is a very productive system. I have been an advocate for Sudan to learn from it. There is a lot to learn from Egypt. This is actually what the numbers are saying. This is not, this is not just, there is evidence of like increase and improvements in population, in yield, in yield of fruits, of vegetables, of cereals, of everything that people grow. The Egyptians also have done a lot of work in reusing the water. So up to 20 cubic kilometers of water now reused. And they have also worked in the issue of population. I mean, to their credit, Egypt is a country, when you go there, the government had always been vocal about the need to control the population growth. And they succeeded in moving from African standards of fertility here, like in the 1960s, to something close to the average of the world. That's not enough. It's still the population of Egypt is growing too fast, but there is a significant effort that's shown up here. So, and then what they do is like, because of that's not enough, they import virtual water. And virtual water is the water that you import when you import wheat and soybean and stuff like that. You are basically importing water. So instead of growing it with your own water, you let other people grow it with their water, and then you pay money and you import it in. That's what we call virtual water. And Egypt now, the virtual water import is like, growing up very rapidly. So as a result, in the 1950s and 60s, some water of the Nile used to flow to the Mediterranean, because the Nile water was more than the consumption. But starting around the 1980s, Egypt basically consumes all the water. So all the water of the Nile gets consumed. Not only that, they also increasingly import more virtual water with time. That's what's shown in gray. And they are reusing more water, and that's what's shown in red. So that's actually tremendous, I think, effort done in Egypt to try and solve this problem. It's a very tough problem. But they work, they control the river, and then they are reusing water, they are doing importing virtual water. But what we have concluded from this paper that we published in Nature Communications 2 years ago, is that that's all will not be enough. And that's, this is some of the stresses on the Egyptian economy that basically showing up these days after the war in Ukraine and the problems with like the prices of wheat and so on. The Egyptian economy suffered because of these pressures here. You see here, you have an increasing demand on virtual water because you have more people and because you are growing economically. And so to sustain that, you have to import more and more from outside. And so we propose some policies that could be used to address those. So Egypt currently uses 55.5 cubic kilometers of water. It uses some of Sudan's water share because it flows there. So they welcome flux from the south. And also all the increase in the flow that happened because of climate change is basically being consumed in Egypt. Under the formula that we propose, Egypt will have to scale down its water to 55.5. And that's a very painful thing to do, but that's necessary, I think. This transformation will require significant additional investments in water use technology. You have to be very smart about using water, lining canals, drip irrigation, all those kind of things. Ethiopia, on the other hand, we think we should focus on development of its vast hydropower potential in collaboration with countries in the Nile Basin, including Egypt. Hydropower is something they could develop. They could also focus on potential, developing the potential of rain-fed agriculture instead of irrigated agriculture. And they should also use a limited, they develop irrigation, but to a limited degree, which is the potential that they have. Sudan, unfortunately, Sudan lacks the region. This is here the productivity of agriculture. This is Egypt's story, which I shared earlier. They've improved significantly how productive is their agricultural system. This is what Ethiopia did recently, while Sudan is like busy with all those things, political, problems we had, the Ethiopians were basically, developing their agricultural system and productivity and improved significantly. And Sudan had been flat for the last 60 years or so, unfortunately. That has to do with, as I said earlier, this story of fertilizers, and Egypt is up there. They're maybe over applying fertilizers. They figured out the solution, and they just significantly tapping into it. Ethiopia figured things recently, and their productivity is increasing. Sudan here is at the bottom of the crowd for many parts of the world. So Sudan currently operates at levels significantly below its potential. They are not using a share of the Nile water, never fully utilized, although some recent work in my group saying that we are inching close to that. That's a story for another day. Water use efficiency is very low. Flood irrigation, basically flood the fields. Fertilizer use is probably the lowest in the region, and maybe probably the lowest in the world. Significant gains in efficiency and economic development can be achieved by investments in these three areas, and I'm going to talk about that. And that should be strategic priorities for what I call a Sudan Green Revolution. We have a new project that's trying to help in that direction. Just started last year. So the strategic direction for Sudan: water is not the limiting resource. No, water is the limiting resource, not land. Water should be valued more than land. That's actually true also for Egypt. Water should be priced in agriculture to reflect its limited status in order to incentivize water conservation. About time to start investing in technology for water use efficiency. And any development plan, the key question is how to optimally use water and not how to optimally develop new land. So I'm arguing for vertical expansion as opposed to horizontal expansion. So quickly, some of projects I have proposed recently: improving water productivity in agriculture, improving water productivity in hydropower. These are projects for Sudan. More share of water exports to Egypt, what I call the virtual Nile, and water transfer to the Red Sea development. So the first is about water productivity in agriculture. This is like wheat production in Sudan, a lot of it in the north or Jazeera, and that's happening. Also, millet is in the east, but also millet in the west, more dukhun, and so that's happening without use of fertilizers, while gas that comes out with the exploration and the development of the oil is being flared, is being burned and wasted, and contributing to climate change and global warming. That has to change. Sudan has to figure a way by using some of its these deposits in the gas deposits that we have to produce fertilizers, so that this agriculture could be nurtured. The other area that I thought is also a low-hanging fruit is what happened with GERD. The expectation is the flow of water in the Blue Nile will flatten, would be flat. We estimate that by adding more turbines, you could maybe double the capacity of Roseris. So that's an easy thing to do. You could double the number of turbines and double the capacity for production of electricity. That's something that has to be studied and confirmed too. I have been advocating that Sudan could export livestock, and if you think about it, it's water basically. Livestock is water, because if you don't get it from Sudan, the Egyptian, they have to grow bersim. Bersim consumes water, so instead of bersim consuming Nile water, a lot of the livestock in Sudan is based on rain-fed ranges. So basically, no Nile water is used, and Sudan could make a lot of money, which needs a lot of money to help its foreign currency supplies and so on. And so we estimate you could really revolutionize how much. Some of it is already happening, but you could do a much larger scale and export these animals and export meat to Egypt. The last project I also have been talking about is a project to transfer water to the Red Sea. The Red Sea area is the poorest area of Sudan as far as the hydrology and water availability. And so I propose that water could be pumped from the Nile up the mountain, mainly through pumps that are fed with solar energy. You could use solar energy to basically pump water uphill. So the water goes uphill when it gets close to places like Sinkat and Jebet and so on. You could then get the water down towards Port Sudan. And in coming the water down, you could produce hydropower out of it. So this is like 3,000 feet. 3,000 feet down, that produces a lot of electricity. Long time ago, when I was a graduate student, I visited sites in Italy where Italian produce a lot of electricity out of the mountains in the Alps, in the European Alps, and so that could be done here. You could get the water down, but then for Sudan you could get them not only water but also water and electricity. Also, these areas like Sinkat and Jebet and so on, these are areas that have the best weather in Sudan. All what they lack is water and electricity. And if you bring water and electricity, instead of this region of Sudan is now like a flagship or a major poverty center, it could be transformed into a very rich region. The weather in this area is much nicer up in the mountains here. The weather is much nicer than Khartoum. And a long time ago, people in Sudan used to go for their honeymoons and stuff like that. They used to go to those parts of the country. That could be done. What's lacking is water and electricity, and a project like this would bring both of them, water and electricity. So that's something that's, I think, needs further consideration. So I think with that potentially positive note, I will stop here and take any questions or comments from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elfatih. This is a great presentation. I'd like to open the door for questions, and I can, okay, Yasmin, so I'm going to allow you to talk. Go ahead, Yasmin.
Assalamu alaikum. It's nice to see you, Dr. Elfatih, مرة ثانية في إسابة. إن شاء الله نشوفك مرات ومرات. أنا بس سؤالي سريع جدا. الفيرتشوال ووتر هي شنو؟ وشنو الإمكانية بتاعت إنه يكون في فيرتشوال ووتر في السودان يعني زي مصر؟ What do you mean by it?
And virtual water is like if you are, okay, Egypt now, they could use Nile water to produce wheat. They could use the Nile water to produce wheat, and they do. They use a lot of water. I think they use 10 cubic kilometers to produce wheat. But instead of doing that, you could also go and import wheat from Russia and Ukraine. And if you import wheat from Russia and Ukraine, then you don't need to produce the wheat locally. So in effect, that's a virtual water. So when Egypt goes out and imports wheat, soybean, corn from outside, those are effectively you are importing water. And that's one. And then if you import soybean to produce meat and chicken out of it, then that's also red meat and chicken, that's also virtual water, and that's actually more intensive because it takes a lot of water to produce a kilogram of meat, as opposed to a kilogram of bean or a kilogram of wheat. So the concept of virtual water refers to the idea that when you import products like wheat or soybean or meat, products that it takes water to produce them, you are effectively importing virtual water. And so when I argue that Sudan could export virtual water to Egypt by expanding dramatically, because now Egyptians use a lot of water to produce the meat that they consume. A lot of water. Actually, in the figure that I have, there is a lot of bersim, and there is a lot of, so that consumption of water in Egypt could be reduced if you import the animals from Sudan. And that's in Sudan will not go against our Nile water share, because a lot of the time the sheep and the animals are grown with rain-fed rangelands, and so that's a win-win situation. We could do that. It's good for the water budget of Egypt. It's good for the dollars budget of Sudan, because Sudan needs to export to enhance its exports, so that it could help its economy. And so that's an example for a win-win situation. There is a lot of demand for meat in Egypt. It's now being met by, like, using some of the Nile water or importing virtual water from outside, and it could easily be replaced with meat from Sudan. And some of it is being done, but I'm suggesting that could be expanded dramatically.
Okay, thank you. But still, it's going to be costly to import virtual water, right? So we're saving water for that country, but still they are going to spend so much money in importing these goods.
Yeah, that's a good question. Not always, Yasmin. Sometimes, for example, it takes very little to produce wheat in places like Ukraine and Russia, and because the climates there are different. So those are, and also the climate is different, the temperature is different, and because of that, these crops are very productive over there. So it doesn't cost really much to produce them. And so sometimes importing some of these crops could be cheaper than producing them locally. That's actually a situation that's happening in Sudan, a lot of the time. Like now, there are some of the food crops in Sudan, you find them imported from Ethiopia. Like, you find fava beans, for example, from Ethiopia in Sudan, and so on, because depending on the conditions under which things are produced elsewhere, not necessarily more expensive than doing it. The main reason people are reluctant to go the virtual water all the way has to do with national security issues. So the idea that if you depend on these food crops on imports only, and you don't produce them locally, then you become vulnerable in terms of national security for what could happen in those other countries. Also, it becomes potentially something that other countries could use against you to basically impact you politically. That's what people are reluctant to use the virtual water imports. And those are regions that could be discussed and so on. But it provides a way by which, of course, as I argued, we have to control population. We have to be more productive in terms of water use efficiency, in terms of using fertilizer, so you produce more locally. If you do that, you produce more locally, you control demand. But after you exploit all this, which Egypt did to a large degree, then virtual water maybe becomes the only option that you have. And but it's not an option without problems. It's an option with its limitation and its problems, but not necessarily just the cost of it. It's other things too.
Thank you, Fatih. I do have a question myself, and then I'll let Bakri goes next. So listening to the presentation, so I'm seeing that the share of water is an input. And then the output comes from, one of the outputs come from the formula that you had as a productivity, right? From that equation. And
yeah, the equation, that's okay. Let me just try and go there.
Yeah.
The equation, basically the production, agricultural production, if you think about it, the agricultural production has three components to it.
Correct.
It's availability of water, and then just a second, this is here. Yeah, this is the equation here. So the economic growth, which is how much production you have, the change in that production, there has to be some water available, but it depends on how you use that water.
Correct.
So do you use it with good seeds, with fertilizers technology, or not? So if you do that, then you produce more out of the same amount of water. And then you have to think of your population, because, as the population grows, you have more demand, and so it may not be enough. And so the production per person is what you have to focus on. And these are the three trends. Climate change is a trend that's happening. Everyone in the world now is concerned about it. Technology adoption, however, I think is a major thing in Africa that we have to manage better, and especially in Sudan. And population, I think, is the biggest one, is the biggest problem. And many Africans don't like to talk about it, but it's really like it's the elephant in the room. I personally think if we don't manage population in Africa, then there is no future for that continent. We would be fooling ourselves to think otherwise. It's just like, yeah.
Yeah. So, but this is the economic growth or the crop production.
Yes.
You can add, of course, to it the environmental impact, the equity, education, all of those kind of
absolutely
things. So,
absolutely, those are all important issues. This is my bias in saying these are the main trends that we have to, to have. Although I'm very much for the environment, I'm very much for, but I think it's people have to survive first. Yeah.
So my question it goes beyond that actually. So if you have the water as an input, you have some outputs that you can get from this equation and other equations. There is room for optimization of resources, right? Beyond just the interest of a certain country. Like if we look at, I like that figure you showed, the Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. If you look at the whole system together, and then there is some optimization of resources and a feedback loop to cover the shortage that some country might have to live with, right? So you address it in the virtual water concept.
Yeah, I think there are people who argue for like shared benefits approach where you could rely, different countries could rely on like, for example, you produce electricity in Ethiopia, you produce food somewhere else, you share it. I'm a little bit skeptical about that. I think after managing these trends and each country feeling safe about its aspiration and about its needs, then they may move into a stage in which there could be cooperation. To throw the cooperation and saying, okay, just like, cooperate and without resolving this, how you share the water. I'm skeptical that, I hope it does work. I'm skeptical that it will work.
Okay. Thank you. Bakri, I'll have you to talk now. Please go ahead. You can unmute and ask it.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Elfatih, for a great presentation. Putting all things together and seeing the big picture is something that is we always miss, and we don't have the resources to get. I have two questions. One question is, what is the effect of these lakes, whether it is in Gert or whether in Marawi or Sd al-Ali or even the Suds in the Sudan, which is kind of a natural lake. What is their effect on increasing the rain irrigation in the different areas?
That's a good question, and this is an area that my group specializes in to a large degree. It depends on the scale of the change in land use. So these are things like adding lakes, adding irrigation projects, desertification, all things that you could do to change land cover and land use could potentially impact climate. However, for those impacts to develop, you need to have a large enough scale. Impact, I mean here, impact on rainfall, for example. So we have documented, for example, that the existence of a Jazeera scheme, the existence of a whole Jazeera scheme, which is about 10,000 square kilometers, that leaves some impact on the regional climate. But Gert, Marawi, all those are smaller water bodies. And so introducing them is not likely to make impact on rainfall. It could make impact on what we call the microclimate. The microclimate is like if you're in a small village next to the lake, yeah, and the wind blows from the lake towards your village, then you would feel some impact. Cooler temperature, for example. So when we talk about then these swamps in southern Sudan, actually a lot of the attention has been about the Sudi swamps, but the Sudi swamp is not the largest swamp in southern Sudan. The largest one is the Bahr al-Ghazal one. And that's a much larger one. And there were plans at some point about not only drain, the Sud would have been only the first step. And there would be plans to drain even more of those because you lose a lot of water for evaporation in them. So basically, that's what I showed earlier what I showed in the slide. And maybe I could show that again. Just a second. The water balance of, this water balance. So here, the water that flows into southern Sudan, 2 units, half of the water gets lost. Right. And that water, half of it gets lost in these swamps. More than that, southern Sudan itself is a region that receives a lot of rainfall, but it contributes very little to the Nile. So if you think of this picture here, there is no contribution. For example, Bahr al-Ghazal, it receives a lot of rain, but very little water because of the drainage of that system gets to the Nile. And so people who are interested in increasing the flow in the Nile, mainly to satisfy demand in Egypt, have been thinking, and they were like, in the 1970s, before I came to MIT, there were studies here at MIT that looked at how some of these swamps in the Bahr al-Ghazal, Mashar, there is a swamp called Mashar on Sobat, and then a Sud. There are 3 different swampy areas, Bahr al-Ghazal, Mashar, and the Sud. And so there were studies about estimating how much additional water you could get by draining those swamps. Okay, if you do changes at that scale, Bahr al-Ghazal, Mashar, and Sud, likely that you're going to have an impact on the regional climate. Likely that you may impact, because that's a huge scale. That's the scale of southern Sudan. But when you think of activities at significantly smaller scale, they are not likely to leave impact on rainfall. They could leave local impacts on the microclimate and the local temperature. I hope that answers your. So Merawi, Gerd, those are not going to change the rainfall.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, that answered the question. The second question is, okay, how much water can we take from the Nile to Eastern Sudan? So right now we give Egypt about 6 units, right?
No, Egypt, 6 out, 6, each unit is 12. So, okay. Egypt consumes, I shown the map, the plots for how much Egypt consumes. Here, let me show you. Yeah, this is the Nile water flowing into Egypt. In the early 1960s, in the 60s and 70s, there was more water flowing into Egypt than being consumed. Starting in the 1980s, all the water is being consumed. And it's about 60 cubic kilometers. It's about 60 cubic kilometers. And that, so till the idea about this water transfer project and it has to be done carefully, this water transfer project to Eastern Sudan is a significantly smaller scale. I'm thinking more of like 1 cubic kilometer or less. So it's a small scale, and so it's not a huge amount of water. But if you are in Port Sudan, and people are familiar with the problems of water in Port Sudan, that's a big deal. It's a big deal. That's a lot of water. That's what would basically it's scalable. I think it's scalable. If you inject water into the coastal region of Sudan and the mountainous area, you could transform that region into maybe one of the most prosperous regions of the country, and you could convert this, chronic poverty and lack of economic growth into because it's a region that has it's connected to the rest of the world. Coastal regions are in general, development regions and so on. And, and not only that, this area of the mountains, the high areas, these are areas that have the best weather in Sudan, the best weather. If that region develops, I would love to go and visit and spend time there. The temperature, I think, is like 10 degrees cooler. You could estimate the temperature. This is 3,000 feet, which means like 1,000 meter. 1,000 meter. If you go up every 100 meter, the temperature drops by a degree. So that means it's like these areas up here in the mountains, they are 10 degrees colder than places like on the Nile Valley, which really transform it into a very nice weather. And people could go there, they could enjoy vacations there, everything. You could make it attractive for tourism. You could really make a big transformation. And the idea is you would pump this water up using solar energy. So you do that, you pump the water up with solar energy. So because to get the water uphill, you need energy. So you use solar energy to do that. And when the water, however, comes to the top of the mountain here, then you let it go with gravity. And when it comes with gravity, you could generate electricity, maybe actually more than one side. I estimate that you could generate electricity comparable to what you have in Buenos Aires. And that could supply a lot of energy to places like Port Sudan and surrounding countries. And so it's potentially a transformative project, I think. And it's not, we haven't done all these detailed studies of it. It's a concept now that for it to really be, pursued and financed, there has to be more studies on it and details and designs and so on. But the general concept is very attractive, at least for me.
I see. Great.
Thank you very much. Now, Dean and Naeem, I'm going to have you up. Please unmute.
Hello, hi. Greetings. Thank you very much, Professor Elfatih Eltahir. Thank you very much, Saba and the organizers. Very, very interesting and very educational and informative talk. I have the usual layman question. What is the impact of greed for you, Professor Eltahir, having analyzed everything, overall impact of the GERT for Sudan and for Egypt? Is it really that something big deal to worry about for the Egyptians in scenario of climate change? Is it going to be more beneficial or it has some consequences? And I was impressed by that figure of Egypt using 6 out of 7 of the water, and Ethiopia receives the rain for this water, not producing it 6 out of 7. And Sudan, I don't know. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you, I think the idea of 6 out of 7 produced in Ethiopia, 6 out of 7 consumed in Egypt, people have to take that not independent of the setting that we have. Ethiopia, to think of Ethiopia, I think the country where I live that's very close to Ethiopia in terms of water is Ireland. And Ireland, as I said, the main function of the Irish rivers is to drain the Irish soils, because if the Irish rivers do not drain the Irish soils, agriculture cannot be sustained in Ireland. And so Ethiopia is not Ireland exactly, but that's a closer example. And so it makes sense that a lot of the water will be produced in Ethiopia and consumed downstream in Sudan and Egypt, because Sudan and Egypt are basically deserts. They don't receive rainfall, and so the river there irrigates the land, and it has been irrigating the land for thousands of years. So because that sometimes gets used to say, okay, so I don't want people to develop the idea, maybe the Nile water should be distributed per person. So you see 100 million in Ethiopia, 100 million in Egypt, 40 million in Sudan, you divide the water that way. No, it can't be that way because the natural environment along the river is different. And that's I have written a paper on this that's available in my website. recently. So that's, having said that, okay, so you asked me about GERD. GERD, I written a small document, and I have it actually in the ASAPA website at some point, basically addressing this question, and you could get more details about my answer there. I think GERD, in terms of course, it's beneficial to Ethiopia in terms of like hydropower generation and so on. For Sudan, it's positive for hydropower, it's positive for irrigation. I think, you know, it could have little impacts on the ecology of the Nile because of the change of the seasonal variations of the level of water. That's ecologists could study that. Some people are worried about the potential risks from the geology of the site of the dam. That's also, I think, is a topic that geologists should have a straight answer about that. It's like you know, it should be well known. So in general, it's positive. I don't think the impacts in Egypt are significant, because as long as GERD is used for hydropower, which means you store and release the water. And so if you do that, then you don't consume the water. It's a non-consumptive use of water. One of the things that I raised in that document, which I thought people should look at, is the fact that because of all these political differences and arguments about it, the development of the dam did not follow the standard procedures that people use usually when they do large projects like that. And so that's something that I thought people should take a look at, because when you build a big project like this, there is this financing party, there is the contractor, and then there is the owner, and there is, you know, checks and balances that happen between this in this triangle of things. I'm not sure that happened very well in this case. But I thought in general, Ethiopia and Sudan should be supportive of this project, but it should come in the scheme of like what I suggested earlier. Is like, you know, this is legitimate aspirations for Ethiopia to develop, and people should support it. And some of the electricity could be sold to Sudan or to Egypt for benefits of Ethiopia. People should recognize Ethiopia should get some water for developing irrigation at a limited scale. But I personally think too that Ethiopia should recognize the rights and the use of water in Egypt and Sudan. And so that's a natural thing to happen, that water flowing in the Nile had been flowing, people use it downstream for irrigation. And so Sudan and Egypt should have a legitimate and secure share of the water that's not threatened by projects upstream. So that's part of the equation. The second part of the equation is Sudan and Egypt has to support the natural and legitimate aspirations for Ethiopia to develop, and its right to develop projects like GERD to produce electricity. And they should play, instead of like, you know, obstructing that, they should play a positive role in facilitating that. And also, you know, some of the business plan for GERD is that some of that electricity will have to be sold to downstream to the countries, mainly Egypt. Egypt is the largest economy in the region. Although now they have excess of electricity, everyone now wants to export electricity to Sudan, which is a sad fact. I'm very much against importing electricity in Sudan. I think if you have money that you could use to import electricity, you should use it to build power stations inside the country and produce the electricity, because this electricity is not given to Sudan in you know, Sudanese pounds, is given in dollars. It's sold. Just like you import oil, you import electricity. And so sometimes I feel people get too excited about importing electricity from Egypt and from Ethiopia. I don't think that's in the interest of Sudan to do that, because of like Sudan is relatively, you know, has very limited economically, and they don't have these resources to be able to pay for these imports with hard currency. And so, so those are my views on GERD. More details, you could find them in the document. As I think it's available, Muntasir, it used to be available in the old version of the website of ASAPA. I think it's available now too. Yeah, so people could find it there in the archive. it addresses this question with more details. It's available there.
Yes, thank you, Elfatih. And yes, if you go to the website and you click on the Elfatih profile, you're gonna get all the posts that he has published in ASAP, and you can find all these valuable papers. I have Hatim Sharif next. I'm gonna allow you to talk, Hatim. Please go ahead and mute and ask the question. You are muted, Hatim.
السلام عليكم. شكرا الفاتح.
وعليكم السلام.
سؤال بسيط عن السوليوشنز you proposed. I think your proposed solution of exporting virtual water to Egypt through increasing meat production needs clarification, because if you want to increase our export of virtual water, I think probably growing our meat production is not the best way use of exporting water. And on the other side, also we are, I think, exporting too much water now to the Gulf countries through huge increase in the production of basin, which in itself, I think, is not the best use of our water. And also this, I think, also contradicts with the fact that we are not that rich in water. So I think that recommendation, and even if we talk about meat, Egypt will buy the meat at the best rate it finds. Maybe it is much cheaper to buy from Australia than Sudan. And also for us, if we want to export meat, we'll just probably export to the highest bidder. So there's no meat shortage in the world, so that or in Egypt. So I think Egypt, if they want to solve their meat problem, they will try to find the best way to do that. So I think it needs some clarification. But I think in general, we do not have that much water, so that we should think of increasing our export of virtual water.
Okay, thank you, Hatim. I think the assumption there is that a lot of this livestock is grown in Sudan on rain-fed agriculture. It's not on the Nile water. And so I think I made that clear, that so this is, you are right that there is a lot of water that being exported, virtual water exported to the Gulf based on using the Nile water to grow basin and other things, feed for animals, and then exporting that. That's virtual water export based on the Nile water. And a lot of it is really driven by the fact that people don't really need to pay for the Nile water. They don't pay for it. And that's a big problem in Sudan and in Egypt, that people don't pay for water. You pay for land, but you don't pay for water, which doesn't make sense. But the idea here is, when I argue that this is motivated by the fact that Sudan is in a point in history where it needs to increase its exports. We need to export. A lot of the fact that the Sudanese currency declined the way it did, people are suffering in the country, has to do with the fact that Sudan is not a productive country that does not produce products to the world that would basically help support the Sudanese currency. And so that's from the side of Sudan. From the side of Egypt, water is critically in shortage, and so there is a need for importing virtual water. So the reason I argue for increasing this meat export to Egypt is that the assumption is this is based mostly on rain-fed. This is rain-fed product, mostly in regions in Western Sudan, in Eastern Sudan, and they could be developed and exported to Egypt cheaply. There is the advantage that you could export to Egypt through land, so that's cheaper. If you could find a way to export it through land, that's cheaper than for example exporting it to UAE or other parts of the world. Of course, that will not work if products in Sudan are too expensive. I mean, they have to be economically, and that's a broader issue. And that's a real issue actually in Sudan now. I am concerned that in many of the things that we produce in Sudan, we don't produce them cheap enough to compete in the international markets, and that includes sheep and exports of meat. We have to be smart about producing them economically, efficiently, so that they could compete in the international markets. Because if we don't do that, it's not just this virtual water. Anything else that Sudan wants to export, they will not be able to export because they will be too expensive compared to alternatives. But I think I agree with you that I'm sensitive to, like, if this was based on the Nile water, I would have doubts about it. But if it's really based on rain-fed, then it could be something positive, and it could basically be a win-win for Sudan and Egypt.
Thank you, Elfatih. There is a question from Tariq Hamada that has been in the comments for a while now. He's asking, what are the prospects of water transfer projects to West Sudan as well? And what is the prospect of having water canals for transport as well as the drinking water and irrigation distribution for the large areas of Sudan away from the Nile east and west?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, I mean, if you want to transport water west of the Nile, you have to pump it up. The elevation goes so that as you go west, you have higher lands, and so the elevation goes up. The attractiveness of this eastern Sudan region, the area around Port Sudan, has to do with two things. One of them is that you could really pump the water. You need to pump the water uphill, but you could recover a lot of it when it comes down. And that's basically, so it's not wasted energy. You recapture some of that energy again. The second is that the amount of water involved is small. This is not for agriculture. If you transport it to Western Sudan, it will be for agriculture. It will be too much water. It will be it will have other economics to it. And the third is that this is a region where the ingredient that's missing, the region for priority for Eastern Sudan is because this is the poorest region of the country. The area around Port Sudan and this mountainous area, this is the area that receives the least rainfall compared to other regions of Sudan. While it has a lot of potential, because everyone knows that with this logistics, industry, like, this is the main port of the country, and there is a lot of opportunities for economic development if you have the main ingredients, which are water and energy. Actually, I mean, some economists that I talked to, some of the people who have been working in the economy of Sudan recently, they like the idea very much. They think it has a lot of potential, just from the economic point of view. They think it could just like it could get this system going, and it could have a lot of impact.
Thank you, Elfatih. Just out of curiosity, how rich are the data available for Sudan in general when we talk about whether it's about the GIS data or resources or water or population, or do we really have that much data available on Sudan, and where would it be available?
There is records for rainfall. There are stations that have been maintained around the country. When I first started working in this area, when I did my master, I did a drought frequency analysis where there are stations from around the country, like from Fashir, Niyala, Kadugli, Lubayt, Coast, Khartoum, Kassala, Dalarif, all these major cities, they have long-term records of rainfall. In addition, there are stations that monitor river flow in places like Malakal and Jabal Awliya and Khartoum and Ad-Daim at the border between Sudan and Ethiopia, in Dongola, in Atbara, So at every cross section of the Nile, when they have junction and so on, there is stations monitoring the flow of the Nile, and that's data available for like, you know, maybe 100 years now. And then there is the modern records of like, you know, global data sets of rainfall from satellite, temperature from satellite, vegetation distribution from satellites, elevation, topography. Sudan, as part of the world, there are global data sets that has that information. In addition to that, data on agriculture, crop production, productivity, and so on is available from data sets maintained by the Pharaoh. Population, I think maybe, you know, every once in a while they have a census, and that's basically where the data on population comes. So there could be more, you know, efforts in that direction, but there are data sets related to all these variables that we will talk about.
Okay, thank you. I see two more questions, and then maybe Bakri. I don't know if that's an old hand or a new hand, so I'll give you the chance as well, and then we can wrap up. There is a question from Abdel Munaim Abu Talib saying, what will be the environmental impact resulting from draining the marshlands in South Sudan?
Yeah, I think I answered that to Bakri earlier. It depends on the scale of that. So if it's done at the large scale, in terms of like, you know, as I said, there are three major marshlands. There is Bahr al-Ghazal, there is Mashar, and there is the Sud. If you put them together, this is a huge area, you know, and those, I mean, this is most of the area of South Sudan. And so if you drain those, potentially you could have impacts on temperature and rainfall and stuff like that. If you do activities at a smaller scale, however, drainage swamps at a smaller scale, you know, 10-kilometer scale or so, those may have impacts on the microclimate, but not impacts on rainfall and stuff like that. They would be less limited. So it depends on the scale of the activity. And we have done work on that. In my website, there are papers describing studies on that. I have people could consult.
Okay, and from Tariq again, he's asking about transport canals that loop back to the Nile.
Yeah, I think that's what I talked about earlier, that, you know, going west would require pumping water. Naturally, water flows from the west towards the river. So getting water from the river elsewhere always is an issue. You need to pump the water. The only reason I gave this, you know, this region in the east is because it's really, it doesn't have other, rainfall is very scarce there, and the potential for economic development is huge. And so that may justify limited transport of water. Even that has to be done carefully. Some of these Nile countries may have to be like, you know, although the amount of water is very little, although already some water had been transported to the Sinai, some countries may have concerns if Sudan moves some water to Port Sudan. So that has to be done in collaboration with the countries in the area.
Okay, thank you. Bakri, you have
Okay, shukran. Yes, I have a question about the square of technology, and actually one of the questions came to me by through a text. Is that should you include energy in the equation, or is it already a part of the technology square or the technology term? And then the other question about that term is the fertilizers. So there is a lot of issues with synthetic fertilizers. I'm glad you always talk about seed and fertilizer. So So is there, from your research and the questions, is there more interest in like natural fertilizer, or is it just for scale people should rush towards synthetic fertilizers?
Yeah, those are good questions. The first one about energy. Energy, of course, gets into everything. Energy, agricultural activity needs energy and so on. But the missing piece is mainly the agricultural technologies in terms of like improved seeds, fertilizers, and insecticides. And let me talk about the issue of fertilizer. When I first started doing my graduate work, the lab where I did that, fertilizer is a bad word, because fertilizers is where pollution gets, you apply a lot of fertilizers, they get into the water, they pollute. And now even people talk about emissions of things like nitrous oxide and other gases. They are related to the application of fertilizers. And so if you live in North America and if you live in Europe, and agriculture had been developed through the use of fertilizers, optimized, and economies developed, and people are richer, you start thinking about those negative impacts of fertilizers. It's a very important case where I learned the lesson that the context is very important. So fertilizers, is true that it could be a bad word if in North America and Europe. It's a very good word in Africa, because we apply very little fertilizer. As I showed earlier, in Africa, they apply very little. I think I emphasized that earlier. Maybe it will take me some, but the data is such that, let me see here, just a second. Yeah, this data set here, and I have other maps and so on. I have maps that I could show, and you see here in this graph, least developed that I shared with you. These are African countries. Mm-hmm. So Africa is a continent where people apply very little. These red countries here, people who are applying like 100 times the rate of fertilizers, and they're producing all this food, and they are rich and privileged communities and societies. Those are the people who have to worry about the negative impacts of fertilizers, in my view. And these countries here in Africa, it's now about we are talking about moving from being 10 to being 20. You would still, by doing that, you may be able to double your production, okay? And farmers in places like Al Jazeera and elsewhere would be very happy to do that if they could produce twice of what they do now. And you would still be in the tail of the world as much as impact on the environment is. So you'd be like, contributing like 1/100 or 1/50 of what farmers in the Midwest or in Europe, in France or in China or India have been doing for years. And so I don't really worry about these impacts given the current situation. However, if we start moving up this ladder and you start like Africa moves to like 50 or so, then at that point I would say to the rest of the world that, you know what, we care about the global environment. Let's collaborate, and all of us cut our use of fertilizers together. So that's how I think it's an excellent example for a case in which the context is very important. The context of these scientific questions and how they relate to policies is very important, and practice like use of fertilizers could be something that you could look at negatively in North America and Europe, but when you're faced with a situation of poverty and lack of production and lack of adoption of technology in places like Africa, I'm very much advocate for developing it. And one of the things I concerns me that a country like Sudan, that's supposedly an agricultural country, we don't have any single significant fertilizer factory in the country now. in places like Egypt and elsewhere, those were done in the 1960s, 60s and 70s. And here, after 50 years from that, country that's mainly agriculture, we don't have that technology adopted, and so we have to rely on importing these products from elsewhere, incurring significant costs in terms of transportation and so on. And so I'm not worried about environmental impacts of fertilizers yet, and I hope actually there will be a day in which that people, Sudanese people, will be genuinely worried about that. This is similar to the issue of population too. I mean, in some places when I talk about the population crisis in Africa, people would approach me and they say, you know what, look at Japan and look at Germany. Japan and Germany, their economies are limited because the people, they don't have as many people. The population growth is very small, even China now. And I tell them, look, that's for those countries. I hope that Africa will get to the point where the economic development is limited by the number of people. It's actually now we are in a situation where the economic development is hindered by the growth of population. A lot of people need a lot of services, legitimately need those services, and the government is not able to satisfy them.
Thank you, Elfatih. I have a quick question from Mohammed Khalil saying, thank you, Prof. Elfatih, for the great informative presentation. Just curious if you have received any communications from the Sudanese government seeking your expertise in future economic planning or making informed decisions during negotiation of any agreement with regard to water.
But I don't think I received like in that sense, but I have been like involved with the early on after the revolution, involved with the advisory group for the Ministry of Irrigation and so on. And I have been like, you know, I have written actually a couple of documents that are available in the ISAPA website, and I try to share them through newspapers and so on in Sudan, and they are available. They talk about elements of, program for economic development in Sudan. And some of these ideas, these are preliminary ideas, of course, they are not anything that's close to being implemented, are presented there. And I hope that with this new environment after the change that happened in Sudan, people would like read and listen and so on. But I have not been involved directly in any activity by the government.
Okay. Last question. This time is from Abbas Ali. Dr. Abbas is asking, what about a canal from Jebel Awliya Dam to Khartoum, Nile and northern state? And he's commenting that he was told that the late engineer Saghairun said that Jonglei Canal could lead to negative consequences on White Nile region and Khartoum without an irrigation canal from Jebel Awliya.
Yeah, there is a project about that, about taking water from next to Jebel Awliya and getting it north directly. As I have shown in my presentation, I am very much for vertical expansion of agriculture rather than horizontal expansion. That's where I think this is where the X, that's where I draw the X. I draw the X in like not, there are many projects like that. There is one project in Al-Butana, area to have also big agricultural project there. There is projects on the White Nile that people are talking about, the rehabilitation of all projects. So I have been very much advocate of vertical expansion of agriculture, being smarter about how we use the water, being smarter about how we do the agriculture. And as I shown, we are lacking, even we are behind even by regional standards. Countries like Egypt and Ethiopia, next door neighbors, we are behind them, we are lagging them and lagging behind them. And so we need to be more productive. And so I'm less enthusiastic about anything that will take, expand horizontally and use more water, and more about existing systems, agricultural systems, making them more productive so that you get more per unit volume of water, more per unit land. I think that's where I think there's a lot of potential there, and that's how we manage the technology adoption paths. That's how and it's mainly agricultural technology and water use efficiency technology too.
Thank you, Elfatih. This is a very valuable and great presentation, and we thank you again for sharing your knowledge with ESAPA and with the world, actually, as this will be saved and put on our website for everyone to see. Thank you again. Congratulations again. We're very proud of you, and we're very happy that you're here with us. And thank you everyone for attending, and hope to see you in our future webinars as well.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you. I enjoyed the discussions with all of you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.